Picture this. You are looking at the very last page of the Old Testament. The ink is literally still drying. A prophet named Malachi has just set down his pen, leaving us with this massive, hanging cliffhanger of a promise. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And then, nothing. He just stops. The voice of prophecy in Israel goes completely quiet for 400 years. Welcome. In our explainer today, we are going to dive head first into the loudest, busiest 400 silent years in human history, unpacking that seemingly empty gap between the Old and New Testaments.
So, what actually happened during that huge 400-year gap? Most people just flip from Malachi straight to Matthew in one single breath, treating it like any other regular page turn. But guys, between those two pages sits 4 entire centuries. We're talking empires rising and falling, a holy temple desecrated and miraculously rescued, a single language conquering the globe, and an entire people learning what it really means to wait. It is absolutely not an empty page. As we're going to see, unseen stagehands were frantically building the set in the dark for history's greatest play. Seriously, nothing in the New Testament makes sense until you understand these hidden years.
When we trace the timeline of this epic gap, we can see a massive chasm separating Malachi's hanging promise from the opening scenes of the New Testament. At the very start of this period, the Jewish people were just a small, tired province sitting at the far western edge of the Persian Empire. Honestly, life was pretty quiet. Persia mostly left them alone to keep their own laws and worship their own god. But then, right around 330 BC, the ground started to shake, and an incredible series of historical dominoes began to fall.
Which brings us to our first major shift, the Greek flood and Alexander's cultural tide.
So barely more than a boy, this young Macedonian named Alexander the Great sweeps through the eastern Mediterranean like an absolute flood. The mighty Persian superpower that had ruled the Jewish world for 2 whole centuries, it simply collapsed. But here's the thing. Alexander wasn't just conquering land, he was conquering minds. Everywhere his armies marched, he planted Greek cities, built Greek schools, and installed Greek gods. This triggered a staggering cultural shift we call Hellenization. Just imagine being a Jewish family back then. Suddenly, you're trying to navigate a world where the guy selling bread in the market haggles in Greek, the tax collector writes in Greek, and your own kids come home thinking in Greek concepts that your grandparents wouldn't even recognize. It was this relentless tide of language and ideas, and it forced a brutal question. When the whole world speaks Greek and bows to Greek gods, do you just blend in to survive, or do you hold on to who you are?
Well, Alexander died incredibly young, and his massive empire was immediately torn to pieces by his generals. This left the Jewish people stuck in the middle of a turf war between 2 rival kingdoms, the Ptolemies down in Egypt and the Seleucids up in Syria. But out of all this political grinding, something monumental happened. Down in the grand city of Alexandria, the king decided he wanted a copy of every single book ever written for his famous library. So, around the 3rd century BC, 70 Jewish scholars did the unthinkable. They translated the sacred Hebrew scriptures into everyday Greek. We know it today as the Septuagint. While that initial Greek flood felt like this tragic erasing of their culture, the Septuagint actually handed the historical texts of Israel a passport to the entire known world. For the first time ever, Abraham, Moses, and Isaiah could be read by a merchant in Athens or a soldier in Rome.
Right, moving on to our next era, the hammer and the light, where defending the faith takes center stage.
Things get incredibly intense here. The tension totally snaps when a northern Seleucid king named Antiochus IV takes power. Now, he gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning God made manifest. But the suffering Jews, they called him Epimanes, which literally means the madman. He decided the only way to fix his fractured kingdom was total forced sameness. He tried to violently crush Jewish culture, making it a death penalty offense to keep the Sabbath, to circumcise your sons, or to even own a copy of the scriptures. And then he committed the absolute unthinkable. His soldiers marched right into the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and right on top of the great altar dedicated to the God of Israel, they built a pagan altar to Zeus. And on it, they sacrificed a pig. It was the ultimate desecration. The historical texts call it the abomination of desolation. Families were forced into agonizing choices. History tells us that entire families chose to die by the sword rather than offer even a tiny pinch of incense to a Greek god. It was a terrifying crucible, but it burned away the half-hearted and forged an unbreakable remnant.
But, pressure creates diamonds, right?
Out of this horrible, intense persecution, an old priest named Mattathias simply refused to bow. He sparked a rebellion in a dusty little town, famously shouting for anyone zealous for the law to follow him into the hills. The leadership soon passed to his son Judas, who earned himself a pretty legendary nickname, Maccabee. It's actually not a family name at all. It's a battlefield title that means the hammer. Judas led this total underdog revolt, just a few thousand farmers with stolen weapons going up against the professional elephant-riding war machine of the Greek Empire. And miraculously, he actually started winning.
He fought brilliantly, driving the king's armies back until the road to Jerusalem was finally open. When the rebels arrived, they found the temple in absolute ruins. The altar was defiled, and the sacred lamps were stone cold. So they tore down that pagan altar, scrubbed the holy place completely clean, and exactly 3 years to the day after the desecration, they lit the holy lamps again. This amazing, triumphant moment gave birth to Hanukkah, the festival of dedication, celebrating the festival of the light that finally came back.
Okay, let's look at the fallout of that victory in Part 3, Forging the Caste, through power, politics, and purity. This is where the story gets super interesting, because the very freedom they literally bled for ended up tearing them apart. The descendants of the Maccabees, known as the Hasmonean dynasty, got to rule an independent Jewish kingdom. But, as happens so often in history, power corrupted them. The family that had fought so hard for temple purity slowly morphed into politicians who cared more about their crowns than their faith. The nation began to deeply fracture over what it even meant to be faithful in this new era of wealth and independence. So, over these silent centuries, distinct factions formed to navigate the mess. You had the Pharisees, who built heavy fences of strict rules around the law to make sure the people never drifted again. You had the Sadducees, who became this wealthy temple aristocracy, super comfortable rubbing elbows with Greek and Roman power. Then there were the Essenes, who just abandoned the corrupt system entirely, heading out to the desert to wait for God. And finally, the Zealots, who believed a violent uprising was the only true answer. Over a century and a half, these factions hardened into the exact, ready-made cast of actors that would eventually surround, debate, and follow Jesus.
Meanwhile, while all that intense political drama was happening, something quietly revolutionary was going on in the background. Stretching all the way back to their time in exile, the Jewish people had started a habit of gathering in homes. Wherever 10 faithful families could be found, they'd meet up to read the scriptures and pray. Well, over the silent centuries, this grassroots habit hardened into an official institution. The Greeks called it a synagogue, which just means a bringing together. These synagogues popped up in literally every single city with a Jewish presence. Without even realizing it, they were creating a pre-built, seated audience every week, waiting to hear the scriptures. It was essentially a pre-built pulpit for a future message.
Next up, we hit a massive turning point, the Roman machine. Think of it as both a boot and a highway.
So that independent Jewish kingdom, it didn't actually fall to a hostile foreign invasion. It fell because of a desperate family dispute over the throne. 2 brothers were fighting over who got to be king, and they both reached out to Rome to settle the argument. They essentially invited the Roman lion right through their own front door. The famous Roman general Pompey marched down to Jerusalem and just claimed it for Rome. And then he did something that absolutely cut the Jewish people to the bone. He walked right past all the warning signs and strolled directly into the Holy of Holies, the most sacred empty room in the temple where only the high priest could go once a year. Pompey looked around, totally expecting to find hidden gold or some secret idol. But finding only an empty room, he was kind of disappointed and just walked out. To Rome, this was just a quiet afternoon of standard military routine, just mild curiosity. But to Judea, it was a profound trauma, a wound that wouldn't close for 100 years.
So now, the Jewish kingdom is a Roman province, and a heavy foreign boot is placed firmly on the neck of the Holy Land. But, and this is a huge but, underneath that oppressive Roman boot was actually a masterfully paved highway system. Rome enforced a hard total peace across the known world to stop local wars. They built thousands of miles of safe, perfectly straight stone roads. For the first time in living memory, ordinary travelers could cross entire continents without having to navigate endless hostile borders. The Jewish people at the time only saw the boot of their oppressor. They never imagined they were actually looking at a perfectly paved highway for a future movement.
And that brings us to our final act. The curtain rises in the fullness of time.
So pull all these historical threads together. Look at how perfectly they snap into place to set the ultimate stage. This wasn't an empty pause in history. It was a patient, meticulous preparation off the page, setting a table the size of the whole world. Think about it. Because of Alexander, there was a universal Greek language so everyone could talk to each other. Because of the Ptolemies, the Septuagint Bible was already translated and ready to be quoted. Because of the exile, synagogues were standing in every major city, packed with waiting people. Because of Rome, there were safe, borderless roads for rapid travel. And to top the whole thing off, Rome's local client king, the notoriously ruthless Herod the Great, had spent decades rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem with gleaming white stone and gold. Herod totally thought he was building a monument to his own ego, but he was actually constructing the dazzling grand stage where the opening scenes of the New Testament would play out. Everything was perfectly, brilliantly aligned for a rapid explosion of the gospel message.
And exactly when that stage is flawlessly set, at the very far edge of that 400-year silence, boom. A wild man dressed in camel's hair walks right out of the desert near the Jordan River. John the Baptist begins shouting that the kingdom of God is finally here. Jesus himself would later confirm that John was that long-promised Elijah. Malachi's 400-year-old cliffhanger is finally tied off. The silence had an ending all along, it was just waiting for the exact right voice to break it.
The Apostle Paul actually captures this perfectly. He wrote, "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent out his Son." The biblical narrative doesn't frame this as just some random moment in history. No, it was the exact, fully ripe moment. A moment that faithful souls like Simeon and Anna, who had prayed and waited in that very temple for years, instantly recognized. They saw the 400-year promise fulfilled in the face of a tiny baby being carried up those newly built temple steps. That page between Malachi and Matthew, it was never blank. It was just a magnificent stage being set in the dark.
To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. What looks like absolutely nothing happening is so rarely actually nothing happening. If the grand architect of history was this relentlessly busy during those 400 silent years, literally using massive empires, changing languages, and paving stone roads just to build a masterpiece in the dark, what beautiful stage might be getting set up in your own quiet seasons? Keep that in the back of your mind the next time you feel like you're just waiting in the dark. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and keep learning.